Good afternoon and welcome to Yahweh's Learning Channel. My name is Brother Charles Williams. Today we're going to talk about, are all things lawful? From 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and chapter 10. Now we're going to fully examine chapter 6 to get a context or an idea of what this is saying. Because this is often misconstrued the way Paul states it. How many times have you heard or ever said the phrase, all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful? If you're familiar with this, you likely know it comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 12, or 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 23, which reads,
All things are lawful to me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any.
Okay, and chapter 10, verse 23.
All things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edify not.
Okay, now we're going to come back to a little bit about the understanding of these two scriptures. We're going to look at them a little closer. But many have understood these verses to mean that the Torah no longer applies because all things are lawful. They take that term, all things are lawful, so we can eat anything we want. We can do anything we want. The law does no longer apply. They aren't saying that the Torah has been removed, but that it no longer has any authority over them. They're permitted to do all things and are no longer under the law. Unfortunately, others have used this verse as an excuse to continue their sinful behaviors. Oftentimes, these are individuals who try to claim grace as an excuse to sin. Such a belief is what leads to trampling of the spirit of grace and making the sacrifice of Messiah worthless. This is not the viewpoint I'm intending to address today, though. Our focus is going to remain mainly on the first group, who believe that these verses remove their accountability to the Torah. Is this understanding correct? If so, what does that look like in practical application? Are all things lawful? The statement begins by saying that all things are lawful. So what does that look like? Well, in practical terms, it's understood to mean that we no longer have to keep the appointed times. There are no more dietary instructions, we have no longer have to stone adulterers, etc. That seems fair enough to a degree. But what about the rest of the laws? If all things are lawful, then it's now lawful for us to murder someone? Is it not lawful for us to rape, steal, and sexual immorality, like homosexuality or bestiality, for example? It's even lawful to worship other Elohims, speak to the dead, and practice witchcraft. But wait a minute. Didn't Messiah and Paul state many of those things are sin? Even the same chapter, Paul tells the Corinthians that sexual immorality is wrong. In verse 18.
Flee fornication. Every sin that a man does is without the body, but he that commits fornication sins against his own body.
Okay, now, let's point out something here. Okay, if we read this carefully, it says flee fornication. Okay, that makes sense, right? Look, it says, right after that though, it says, every sin that a man does without the body, but he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own body. So you see, it says every sin. Paul calls out sexual immorality as a sin, which is still breaking the law of Elohim. Okay, every sin. Okay, which that implies sexual immorality is a sin as well. But he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own body. In fact, literally, 2 to 3 verses prior to verse 12, Paul goes through a list of things that are sin and will prohibit people from entering into the kingdom of Yahweh, the kingdom of heaven. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 and 10.
Know ye not that the righteous shall not inherit the kingdom of Yahweh? Be not deceived, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor abusers of themselves with mankind, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners shall inherit the kingdom of Yahweh.
Okay. Now we see here in this chapter it said the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of Yahweh. And it goes on to list all these things. One of them is fornication and adultery. Okay, Messiah points out how idolatry is wrong in Matthew chapter 4, verses 8 through 10.
Again, the devil takes him up into an exceeding high mountain, and shows him all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them, and says unto him, All these things will I give to you, if you will fall down and worship me. Then said Messiah Yahweh unto them, Get thee hence, Satan, for it is written, Thou shalt worship Yahweh thy Elohim, and him only shalt thou serve.
Okay, so we see how Messiah points out that idolatry is wrong. Okay, now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul warns against not to fall into idolatry and sexual immorality. Okay, now if all things were lawful, Paul wouldn't have said this in these scriptures. He wouldn't have said what he said in chapter 6. He wouldn't have contradicted himself in chapter 10. Okay, chapter 10, verses 6 through 8.
Now these things were our examples, to the intent we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. Neither be ye idolaters as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and rose up to play. Neither let us commit fornication as some of them committed, and fell in one day 30 and 2,000.
Okay, and how about verse 14?
Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry.
Wow, look at that. Messiah in chapter 4, verses 8 through 10 talks about idolatry. And Paul again reiterates what Messiah said about fleeing idolatry. He also talks about getting away from immorality, sexual sin. So it should be clear from these few verses that all things being lawful cannot literally mean everything is lawful. It can't. There's no way. There's still restrictions. Okay? We need to use discernment when reading the scriptures. Doubly so when we read the books of Paul. After all, Peter did warn us about how Paul can be confusing and lead us into the same errors as the lawless. Okay, 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 14 through 17.
Wherefore, beloved, seeing that you look for such things, be diligent that you may be found of him in peace, without spot and blameless, and account that the suffering of our Master is salvation, even as our beloved brother Paul, also according to the wisdom given unto him, has written unto you, as also in all his epistles, speaking in them of these things, in which are some things hard to be understood, which they that are unlearned and unstable wrest, as they do also the other scriptures to their own destruction. Ye therefore, beloved, seeing that ye know these things before, beware lest you also, being led away with the error of the wicked, fall from your own steadfastness.
You see that? We can wrestle with the scriptures to our own destruction. We can twist and turn the scriptures so that we can make them say what we want them to say. Oh, all things are lawful. But here it says that the things that Paul says are hard to be understood, which are unlearned and the unstable rest. The word rest there means wrestles or battles with, okay? As they do the other scriptures under their own destruction. Okay, this would lead us to believe that it must be a contextual statement. Paul appears to be responding to something going on in Corinth, where people were using this phrase. Let's read them again, but this time let's note how Paul says those words, but it appears to be bringing out correction. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 12.
All things are lawful to me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any.
Okay. All things are lawful unto me, but all things are not expedient. Okay. It says, but I will not be brought under the power of any. Okay. So we're seeing that he appears in the scripture to bring out more correction or more clarification. How about chapter 10, verse 23?
All things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edify not.
Okay, again, we see the word but. All things are lawful for me, but. Okay, and then all things are lawful for me again, but. He brings out bringing out correction in these two scriptures. Paul is teaching a lesson to someone who is misusing that phrase, all things are lawful. Do we know anyone here today that is using that term, or do we know in our regular personal life anyone who uses that term, all things are lawful? We know Paul still supports obedience to the Creator from other places in his letters. Therefore, it would not make any sense at all for him to be suddenly saying that everything's now lawful. All of a sudden he said, okay, you're free to do whatever you want. You know, all things are lawful. You know, you can eat unclean foods, you can, you know, sexual sins and idolatry. No, he would not ever do that. Okay? Okay, he wouldn't be saying that his obedience to the Torah he would not be saying the obedience to the Torah is no longer important. He would not do it because Paul, although people would contend with this statement, Paul kept the law. I'm not trying to be poetic there, but Paul kept the law, and that is throughout all his books. All the books that Paul wrote. Okay? Now, are all things lawful? Yes, they are. Let me clarify this. So what does Paul mean when he's agreeing with that phrase, all things are lawful? We really need to understand the context of the letter Paul was writing up to this point. We're not going to cover it in depth in this teaching, but we're going to hit upon a few high points in this teaching. In the chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians, we see Paul referring to an issue of division within the congregation. Now, this division seems to have a root in pride and arrogance, with boasting, and stems from whom they followed out, or from their level of knowledge. Okay, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 10 through 14.
Now I beseech you, brethren, by the name of our Master, Yahweh Messiah, that you all speak the same thing, that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. For it has been declared unto me of you, my brethren, by them which are in the house of Chloe, that there are contentions among you. Now this I say, that every one of you saith, I am of Paul, and I am of Apollos, and I am Peter, and I am Messiah. Is Messiah divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank Yahweh that I baptized none of you but Crispus and Gaius.
Okay, so you see here, you see the division in these scriptures of amongst the believers. Okay, now as in chapter 1, chapter 2 speaks about the wisdom of the Creator being greater than the wisdom of men. Now in chapter 3, Paul admonishes those in Corinth about how they're living in the flesh and not in the spirit. He continues to remind them that they really have no room to boast. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 1 through 4.
And I, brethren, could not speak unto you as unto spiritual, but as unto carnal, even as unto babes in Messiah. I have fed you with milk and not with meat, for hitherto you were not able to bear it, neither yet now are you able. For ye are yet carnal. For whereas there is among you envying, and strife, and divisions, are ye not carnal, and walk as men? For while one saith, I am of Paul, and another, I am Apollos, are ye not carnal?
Okay, so we see here, okay, he continues to remind them that there is no room to boast. He knows he's speaking to them about, in Corinth, about boasting. Now let's drop down a little bit further down, same chapter, verses 21 through 23.
Therefore let no man glory in men, for all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Peter, or the world, or life, or death, or things present, or things to come. All things are yours, and ye are Messiah's, and Messiah's is Yahweh's.
Okay, now, as we come to chapter 4, Paul changes gears a little bit. Okay, he puts it from first gear to second gear here in chapter 4, so to speak. Okay, he tells them how servants of Messiah need to be faithful with what they've been given. He tells them how they should not pronounce judgment until Yahweh comes and he will bring to light any darkness. When we put this all together, we see that none of them should be arrogant or boastful. None of them are truly any better than anyone else. Have you ever met someone who feels like they're better than everyone else? They're proud. They're very proud of themselves. It's one thing to carry yourself well, to know who you are, but it's also something totally different when you're boastful about it. You're proud of the way you are. You show off the way you are because you're proud. Okay, 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 5 through 7.
Therefore judge nothing before the time until Yahweh come, who will both bring to light the hidden things of darkness, and will make manifest the counsels of the hearts. And then shall every man have praise of Yahweh. And these things, brethren, I have in a figure transferred to myself and to Apollos for your sakes, that ye might learn in us not to think of men above that which is written, that no one of you be puffed up for one against another. For who maketh thee to differ from another? And what hast thou that thou didst not receive? Now, if thou didst receive it, why dost thou glory as if thou hast not received it?
Okay, so he even goes so far in these scriptures right here to remind us that they should not go beyond what is written. Wow, it's like a fence and a yard. You fence out your yard when you get a new dog, and that's to make sure they don't go outside that border. Okay, and that's what he's saying here. He's trying to explain to them not to go. Shouldn't go beyond the borders of what is written in the scriptures. he made a special note that there are still boundaries. Now, chapter 5, when we go into the next chapter, chapter 5, okay, it refers to one of those boundaries being broken, which is sexual immorality. In fact, what is done is heinous things. It's something specifically prohibited in the Torah. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 and 2.
It is reported commonly that there is fornication among you, and such fornication as not so much as named among the Gentiles, that one should have his father's wife. And ye are puffed up, and have not rather warned, that he that hath done this deed might be taken away from among you.
Okay, so we see here that it's found in the Torah. Now, this here, is found in the Torah in Leviticus chapter 18. Once again, it's showing that all things are being lawful. It does not mean that laws of Elohim never have stopped applying. Okay, no longer apply. They stop. Okay, because he's repeating something that's back in the Torah. Back in Leviticus chapter 18. Let's look at those scriptures. Leviticus chapter 18, verses 6 through 8.
None of you shall approach to any that is near of kin to him to uncover their nakedness. I am Yahweh. The nakedness of your father or the nakedness of your mother thou shalt not uncover. She is thy mother. Thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. The nakedness of your father's wife thou shalt not uncover. It is thy father's nakedness.
Okay, so Paul has once again reminded them how they have no right to boast. At the end of chapter 5, Paul makes reference to a previous letter and how the Corinthians should stay away from sexual immorality. Now, question, if all things are lawful, why is he telling them to stay away from sexual immorality? It makes no sense. In fact, he states that they should even refrain from a brother, as in a like-minded believer, who is practicing sexual immorality. He even admits that they should not be judging someone by the Torah, if they're not a believer. Instead, leave that judgment for Yahweh. We are sometimes too quick to judge unbelievers. We need to leave that judgment to Yahweh. They should, however, be judging one another, the saints, the believers, okay, according to what? Not according to what Paul teaches, not according to the New Testament, but they should be judging each other by the Torah, because that was the only scriptures they had written at that time. Okay? Okay? Now he's differentiating something here. He's differentiating believers practicing sexual immorality from those in the world practicing it. Based upon the beginning of this chapter, they had clearly not been doing this correctly. Was interesting in the beginning on chapter 5 verses 1 and 2, which I meant to bring up when we had it up there. It says that there was fornication among them, the believers, so much more not mentioned as the Gentiles. Now, there was a lot of fornication spoken of about them, even more than Gentiles unbelievers, which is quite a thing, okay? Now, based upon the beginning of this chapter, they had not been doing it correctly. This brings us to chapter 6, where it starts out talking about how believers should be able to work out grievances among themselves without involving the law, or in our modern vernacular, it would be our courts of society, or what could be a Greek culture or society at that time. In other words, they weren't supposed to bring a grievance with another brother, another believer, to the courts of the system, the Greeks. They weren't supposed to do that. They were told that they need to work it out themselves. Yet the believers in Corinth were taking their grievances to the secular courts. They couldn't even trust themselves to be fair and righteous. They had greater trust in the law of the land than in one another. Well, that's a tough thing. They had trust in the law of the land. Hope that we never get there. Okay, 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Let's look at the first 8 verses.
Dare any of you, having a matter against another, go to law before the unjust, and not before the saints? Do you not know that the saints shall judge the world? And if the world shall be judged by you, are you unworthy to judge the smallest matters? Know ye not that we shall judge angels? How much more things that pertain to this life? If ye then have judgments of things pertaining to this life, set them to judge who are least esteemed in the assembly. I speak to your shame. Is it so that there is not a wise man among you? No, not one that should be able to judge between his brethren. But brother goes to law with brother, and that before the unbelievers. Now therefore there is utterly a fault among you, because you go to law with one another. Why do you not rather take wrong? Why do you not rather suffer yourselves to be defrauded? No, you do wrong and defraud, and that your brethren.
Okay, so we see here what I was saying, that he speaks to their shame in verse 5, that that in verse 6, that brother goeth to the law with brother, and before the unbelievers. In other words, they're taking their grievances with one another to unbelievers. Now, Paul expected the believers in Corinth to be able to handle their own disputes among themselves. They had the Torah, what was written was mentioned in chapter 4. Yet they were unable to judge each other fairly, as they were even wronging and defrauding one another. Now, let's look at this. Let's look at how it continues here, okay? Verses 9 through 11.
Know ye not that the righteous shall not inherit the kingdom of Yahweh? Be not deceived. Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor abusers of themselves with mankind, nor thieves, nor covetousness, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners shall inherit the kingdom of Yahweh. But such were some of you. But ye are washed in the name of Master Yahweh and by the Spirit of our Elohim.
Okay, now, why do you think that the sexual immorality was such a problem with Corinth, the Corinthians? Was it the underlying problem here? Culture? Was that the problem? The Greek culture and law by which they lived permitted such things as prostitution and casual sex. Sex was considered natural and normal, not really any different than eating or drinking. Thus we see the problem. While the Torah forbids such things, their Greek culture and law of the land did not. Much of what Paul was teaching against in the previous verses was permitted, even encouraged. This is the mindset and the culture of the believers in Corinth that they had to overcome. This appears to be why Paul is using the phrase, all is lawful. There must have been some argument or defense being used, stating that they were following the law. After all, what they were following, though, was the Greek law, the law of the unbelievers, saying that all things were lawful. They could do whatever they want. But the law they were referring to is the law of the land, not the law of Yahweh. We are in this world. We're under the laws of this world. We get caught speeding. A cop pulls us over. We get a ticket. We deserve that ticket. because we're under the laws of the land. But we need to obey the laws of Yahweh more than the laws of the land. In other words, what I'm saying is, I'm not saying total rebellion. What I'm saying is that the laws of Yahweh, the laws of the Torah, should trump or be ahead of the laws of the land. This is why Paul states that yes, all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. Yes, all things are lawful, but he should not be dominated by anything. This last one is likely referring to addictions and fleshly indulgences such as alcoholism and maybe even sexual addictions. Just because something may be legal does not necessarily mean it is a good idea. For example, alcohol is legal in this country, but it doesn't mean it's good for us. Okay, if we get too full of alcohol, we could do things that we shouldn't do. Okay, now it's perfectly legal for a 21-year-old to purchase and consume alcoholic beverages. That doesn't mean it's a good idea for him to become an alcoholic and to get crawling on the floor drunk every night. Similar context should be carried through into 1 Corinthians chapter 10 as well. Remember, we find a similar statement by Paul here in chapter 10, verse 23.
All things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edify not.
Okay, so it's lawful for people to take and to eat meat sacrificed to idols. It wasn't necessarily even against the law of Elohim or the Torah to eat meat brought to the marketplace. However, it wasn't necessarily helpful or profitable. This was especially true when around a new believer or someone who was weak in the faith. This is why all things may have been lawful, but they weren't necessarily helpful to the new believers. Even if we're living more righteous in some ways than in other ways in the body, this is no reason for us to think of ourselves better than them, or superior or better than other people. Such thoughts lead us to become prideful and arrogant. Even if we're more mature in the faith, we should not flaunt that maturity and do things that could tempt others to give them the wrong idea. If you're hanging around somebody and you know that they don't, let me think of an example here, they can't drink wine because it does things to their body. If you go stand before one of them and you drink wine, you're tempting them to do wrong. Okay, and we're not supposed to do that. We're not supposed to tempt the people who are weaker in the faith. Now, most of us wouldn't invite someone out for an alcoholic drink if we know that they struggle with alcoholism or they're working to abstain from alcohol. There's no difference here. In conclusion, over the years, many have taught 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 12, and chapter 10, verse 23, as indicating the law of Elohim, the Torah, no longer applies. They have taught that this is part of the freedom they've received through Messiah. To be fair, there are many Christian teachings out there that do not teach in this way, but do actually teach something very similar to what we've just presented, minus the statement of the Torah still applying. From a practical perspective, Paul's statement of all things are lawful cannot possibly refer to the Torah no longer applying. Within that same letter, Paul referred to the breaking of a specific commandment found in the Torah as something that is bad. We also see how applying the logic cannot be applied across the board because that would permit things such as idol worship, murder, adultery, among other things. We have to bring into context the whole letter of Corinthians. There was division forming among the body based on upon those who followed, and there was a large amount of arrogance because of it. We found out what Paul was really fighting against was the culture and the law of the land, where sexual immorality and other such behaviors were permitted. Paul was agreeing to the law of the land, permitted that the law of the land permitted the believers behaviors that did not make them a right behavior. But if a behavior, even if lawful according to Torah, would harm another by leading them into temptation to fall back into their pagan ways, then that should be avoided. This was the exact situation referred to in chapter 10. Living a life set apart is what we're called to do. The nations, society around us should see us living differently from them, not doing the same things just because it's legal. Our goal is to shine the light of the word to the nations, to do that which we have been living the word of Elohim, not just talking about it. Well, that concludes this message for today. All things are lawful. We do hope you were blessed by this message. Yahweh bless.
Yahweh's Learning Channel thanks you for watching this video. We hope you were edified by this content. Reach out to us with the information provided on screen, or you may click on the links to view more of our videos. Please subscribe to be notified of new uploads. Until next time, Shalom.